You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 FM, coming to you now live from beautiful and very cold downtown Spokane. It's Long Waves with Gary Krug. As always, I have to tell you at the top of the show that the opinions expressed on this show are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff, management, or of our underwriters. And thank you so much for joining me today. I hope everybody is slowly but surely getting their power back on. I was out for 6 days and 12 hours, almost to the minute. It was the darndest thing. And it was great to see people pull together and show that great Northwestern spirit that these things don't beat us. They just make us stronger and generally friendlier. I saw so much cooperation out in the world. I wish I could see such cooperation going on in the international world, but that just doesn't seem to be happening. So today's show I'm calling 3 Minutes to Midnight. Midnight refers to the Federation of Atomic Scientists, who, of course, keep the doomsday clock. And when we get closer to a catastrophic global nuclear war, we get a little closer to midnight. And I think events in the Middle East of late have pushed the clock just a touch more toward midnight. I'm referring, of course, to the downing of a Russian fighter, and a Russian bomber, rather, an Su-24, which was shot down yesterday. It fell in Syria, and one of the crew members was murdered, killed as he descended in his parachute, and then was seriously wounded. And of course, Turkey said, well, you know, we said we were going to defend our airspace. Our territorial airspace was going to be defended. And Turkish officials said, and they told the world and they told the U.S., this plane was in our airspace. We warned them 10 times. They were in our airspace for 5 minutes. And a number of people have noted, a number of folks have noted that this just doesn't make sense. Turkey even sent a letter to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the members of the UN Security Council that this plane, flying at 19,000 feet, violated Turkey's national airspace to a depth of 1.36 miles and 1.15 miles in length for 17 seconds. Okay, well, if you do the math on that, that's almost, as Moon of Alabama point out, that's almost the stall speed for this plane. It has it flying at 243 miles an hour, which is not the speed they were likely flying at. More likely it was much faster. But here's the point. He had Turkey going on about how the plane was clearly violating their airspace, how Turkey warned them repeatedly and then attacked them. Turkey produced a little radar picture, but if you look at the little radar picture, and Turkey themselves said the plane was only in their airspace for 17 seconds. 17 seconds. And Turkey had an F-16 in the air, fired apparently a single air-to-air missile, and destroyed the plane. It was struck in the tail section. Both crew members bailed out. One of them fell into a group of, well, let's call them the non-terrorist terrorists, and was murdered. The other one, however, was rescued. So Turkey says it was a violation of their airspace, and in 17 seconds, somehow, they managed to respond. with a missile. Okay. This makes no sense whatsoever. This was not a protection of their airspace. This was a trap. This was a trap. They were waiting for a lone Russian jet to get anywhere near their border, and they were going to pop it down because there is really no love lost between the Russians and the Turks. But the real reason is the Turks and the Americans want to establish this, for some bizarre reason, want to establish this no-fly free zone of friendly terrorists and friendly jihadists in the north of Syria, just below the Turkish border. Anyway, we'll get into that in a minute. I've got a lot of this to talk about today. So, it would seem that Turkey, Ankara, and Erdogan were retaliating, perhaps. And this is speculation. We're retaliating against the Russians for bombing Turkish so-called friendly insurgents. I trip over these words. It's hard to do the double talk. But as Moon of Alabama pointed out on the 24th, quote, of course, Russia wasn't just bombing Turkish civilians for the hell of it. It's likely Moscow was targeting the very same FSA, Free Syrian Army, affiliated Alwiya al-Ashar militiamen who shot and killed the parachuting Russian pilot. So these people are already in place, and again, more about these people in a little bit. So, the Russian response to all of this was curious. Very strong words, but so far really very, very restrained, especially for the Russians, who were less restrained against this group of jihadis who they bombed rather to oblivion, and that was to be expected. The U.S. would have likely done the same thing. That's how countries tend to react. But let's take this whole incident for a minute. Here's Turkey. This is hilarious in a really black humor sort of way. Here's Turkey going on about how they had to defend the integrity of their airspace. Good, fine for you. Somebody crosses your airspace for 17 seconds. If, in fact, that even happened, the Russians are still denying that they actually entered Turkish airspace. But let's go back just a few short years. Journey with me now down the hoary halls of time, back to 2012, when Erdogan criticized Syria for shooting down a Turkish fighter jet. Erdogan saying, quote, even if the plane was in their airspace for a few seconds, that's no excuse to attack. That's from 2012. He continued, it was clear this plane was not an aggressive plane. Still, it was shot down. And he hardened his military position after this happened. Okay, let's continue. The head of the general staff of the Turkish army described a violation of 1 or 2 kilometers of airspace as natural, given the speed of the aircraft, and went on to say that airspace violations can be resolved by warnings and interceptions. Interception is when you fly out to where they are and make it real clear that you're there and armed. So, Turkey that same year, 2012, Turkey was engaging in incursions on Greek airspace with fighter jets and military helicopters, and the Greek Air Force had to deal with them. And indeed, Papandreou did, but that's another story for another day. So it's a little disingenuous and hard to swallow that Turkey is all about, the sovereignty of airspace. And let's remember that Turkey is regularly violated airspace in Iraq, and the U.S. continues to violate the airspace of Iraq and Syria. It's important to keep these things in perspective. So, the surviving pilot, both pilots were immediately thought dead, but the surviving pilot said there were no warnings. The Russians have say they have no recordings, or they heard no warnings, which they would have heard, because that place is so lined with electronic warfare and radio intercept devices and all of this. So it's a little surprising that everybody says they had no idea, except Turkey, who says, yeah, we gave him 10 warnings in 5 minutes. And the surviving co-pilot says that they did not fly through Turkish airspace, nor were they warned of an imminent attack. Again, this was a trap. This was an ambush. This was one of those nasty little tricks that countries pull on each other from time to time. And according to Moon of Alabama, again, if you don't know this site, moonofalabama.com, Moon of Alabama, all one word, they do some very, very good analysis. I don't know who these people are, but they're very good, and their material is extremely well documented. So, moving along with them, there is a McClatchy piece that they cite, McClatchy News, which quotes a Western diplomat as saying the shooting down of this Russian jet was an orchestrated event. One Western diplomat based in Iraq, but with extensive experience in Syria and Turkey, quoting now, called the incident brazenly orchestrated and inevitable. Brazenly orchestrated. The foreign minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, also came to that conclusion, saying, quote, "We have serious doubts that this act was unintentional. It looks very much like a pre-planned provocation." And Lavrov went on to point out that Syria had not tried to maintain proper communication with Russia. He went on to point out the rather excessive abundance of footage of this plane being shot down. There seemed to be lots of cameras on this. There are indeed ways of dealing with these kinds of incidents. Even if it were a real incursion, there are ways these things are generally dealt with. So, why would Turkey do that? Why would Turkey shoot down this jet? Hang on, we're going to get to that one too. So, who are these friendly jihadis in the north of Syria and on the Turkish border? Who are they? The Syrian government keeps calling them Syrian Turkmen. But who are these people? Well, a lot of the sources I'm reading say these are largely people from Central Asia, and they constitute terrorist groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra, Ansar al-Shams, Jabhat Ansar ad-Din, and Ahrar al-Shams. So there's a whole bunch of little groups out there fighting. But who are the people who are fighting there? Are these Turks? No, actually a lot of them are Uyghurs. Uyghurs from China who have been smuggled in as members of the Turkestan Islamist Party. And if you dig around, you can even find that they have little jihadist training centers in their areas. They flaunt quite a bit with videos and pictures. They're very proud of these things. the real Syrian Turkmen, the few genuine Turks who are in that area, who are jihadis, even the BBC says they work together with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. And their leader and spokesman is one Alparslan Salik, who's a Turkish citizen. So, as Moon of Alabama pointed out, the Turkish claim of defending Turkmen in Syria is a sham. It is mostly defending foreign Islamist fighters, foreign Islamists, terrorists. So, anyway, there's all kinds of tensions ratcheting up in the region because of this. The Russian heavy missile cruiser Moskva is now working the area rather seriously. It's a state-of-the-art Russian cruiser with extensive anti-aircraft capabilities. And Russia has officially announced that it's going to be deploying 2 of its new S-400 air defense systems. These are also stupidly sophisticated, can engage at great distances, multiple targets. They're really good. So what will happen now is that every plane that flies out of Turkey, or every plane that flies towards Syria, is going to be lit up by this air defense system, this S-400 and other surface-to-air and air-to-air missile systems, which is, I understand, quite the wake-up call for pilots, because their warning sensors go off and buzzers buzz and lights flash, and you know you're being tracked or locked on by a missile launcher. So this idea that somehow Syria is going to have this safe zone, or that America is going to create a no-fly zone over Syria so they can bomb it back to rubble, as happened in Libya, this is just not going to happen. This is just not going to happen now. And the Russians are going to have their own kind of revenge. Think about this for a minute. Turkey is one of the big Russian vacation destinations, as was Egypt. Some 4.5 million Russians once upon a time vacationed in Turkey. The Russians will not be doing this anymore. 4.5 million tourists are not going to visit this country. And the same's already happened with Egypt. Russia has essentially banned flying into and out of Egypt. And Russians, being remarkably patriotic people generally, are not going to go to Turkey regardless. So this is going to be a large crash in money. And there was also some talk about Turkey's dependence on natural gas from Russia. And it seems that some people in Turkey thought a little, thought and afterthought about the shooting down of this Russian jet, that maybe this was getting a little bit serious. You think? And so they issued this communication. Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu said, quote, "Russia is our friend and neighbor. Our bilateral communication channels are open, but our security, as for every friendly country, should be based on the principle of respect under international law. It is normal to protect our national airspace." Oh, now it's international law, is it? Oh, goody. Let's talk international law. Russia was actually invited into Syria. The Americans weren't. The Turks weren't. The jihadis certainly weren't invited. Russia was, in accordance with international law. And Syria has been an ally of Russia for quite a while. And one tends to defend one's allies by any means necessary. So, what has been the response of the rest of the world to this lunacy? This is where it starts getting interesting. Among the other responses, I mentioned the heavy cruiser Moskva that the Russians have launched. But the other thing they've done, and the S-400 rocket system, the surface-to-air rocket system, which, as I said, is stupidly good, stupidly effective, and very advanced. In addition to that, they're now flying what the United States Air Force would call caps on all of their combat missions. So they'll have their Su-24s, their Su-25s doing bombing. And above them, they're going to have fighter jets. Some of the sources I have read say that the carrier Moskva and these fighter jets flying caps will likely have authorization to use force without calling for it. If they feel threatened, if they feel challenged, it is, some of the Russian press has been saying, yes, we will, they have the authorization. So that's a hair trigger. That means a pilot in a plane, a ship captain, a missile base officer looks at the situation, goes, yep, that's an enemy plane. He looks threatening, take it out. So the Turks' response to this was to send up a big flight of F-16s and to send a bunch of tanks to their border, some 20 new tanks they sent to the border. So, golly gee, that's not going to exacerbate things at all, is it? It's just not going to exacerbate things at all. Well, of course it will. It is important in examining this situation to look at the words of some of the key players. Well, I read you some of the words of Lavrov. I read you some of the words of the Turkish Prime Minister. Let me read you some of the words of Russian President Vladimir Putin, who gave an address on state-owned TV. Right after the shooting down of the Russian plane, he went on TV and called it a stab in the back by the accomplices of terrorists. A stab in the back by the accomplices of terrorists. He's referring to the Turks. The accomplices of terrorists. Well, yeah, indeed. Let's examine this point. It's not just Putin saying stuff to be saying stuff, as I've discussed on this show, as there is ample evidence. Turkey is instrumental in funding, in enabling, in providing support to all manner of Islamist extremist groups, jihadi groups. And I'm going to try and quit saying Islamist jihadis. I'm just going to say jihadis because I don't think they are really Islamic, whatever they say, but that's another show too. Anyway, so you think about ISIS. All of these foreigners who've come into Syria and into Iraq, a lot of them, many of them, perhaps most of them, have come through Turkey and continue to. The weapons, the flow of weapons into Syria and into the jihadi hands, again, Turkey. The oil that ISIS was pumping out, putting in trucks, and driving to be sold for millions and millions of dollars. Oh, where were they selling that? They were trucking it to where? Turkey. And, of course, Turkey knew this. There are even some in the foreign press who allege that a family member of Erdogan is benefiting significantly, personally, financially, from the sale of this oil. Well, somebody has to be, don't they? I mean, it's not like you just set up a stand and go, hi, I've got 1,000 trucks full of oil. Who wants it? No, that's not how the game plays. They have big money. Quoting South Front, ISIS has big money, hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars from selling oil. In addition, they are protected by the military of an entire nation, meaning Turkey. One can understand why they are acting so boldly and blatantly, why they kill people in such atrocious ways, why they commit terrorist acts across the world, including in the heart of Europe. Including in the heart of Europe. Those words I was just reading you, ISIS has big money. They're protected by the military of an entire nation. Why they're acting so boldly and blatantly? That's President Putin again, describing, well, probably Turkey. But it also leans a bit toward the U.S. Putin went on to say that we will never tolerate such atrocities. And he ended his speech by saying, quote, President Putin, instead of contacting us, Turkey went to its partners in NATO to discuss this incident, as if it was us who downed a Turkish plane, and not vice versa. What? They want to make NATO serve ISIS? Stabbed in the back by accomplices of terrorists. Well, those are harsh words indeed, but it does make a particular kind of sense. So, U.S. response? Well, initially, U.S. were playing kind of mum, but they have dispatched the CVN-75 Harry Truman aircraft group, carrier group. And, of course, the French were sending the Charles de Gaulle, their aircraft carrier. So we've got the Harry Truman and its group, the Charles de Gaulle, the Russian carrier, the Russian cruiser, Moskva, and everybody's on a hair trigger. Gee golly, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? So on the one hand, you have this severe violation of international law. We have this attack on the Russian plane. The French, when they were going down there initially, this is the fun part, when the French were initially, right after the Paris attack, they were going to send some planes down there, and they did. They sent some planes down and bombed some ISIS targets, they say, and they dispatched their aircraft carriers so they could do, close-in support, so you can do more sorties. And somewhere in all of this, they talked to the Americans, and the Americans convinced them to join the American team, or stay on the American team, rather than heed any of the calls that have come from, say, Bashar al-Assad or President Putin, or any of the people who are actually doing some seriously, hands-on, tough work down there fighting the jihadis. So Now there's talk of even more special forces, boots on the ground in Syria. Because that worked so well last time, didn't it? And that worked so well in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And maybe it's not about winning. Maybe there's something else going on here. But before I talk about that other something else that could be going on here, we need to consider who actually has the approval of the appropriate international bodies to be conducting any military operations in Syria at all, except for, of course, the Syrian government. Well, the UN Security Council gave approval for Russia's military campaign in Syria. And they also kind of jumped up and down on the idea of these moderate jihadis and squashed it into the ground. I want to quote Alexander Mercouris here. Back in September, when it became clear the Russians were intending to act in Syria, the press predicted the Russians would try to get a resolution from the UN Security Council to give additional legal cover for their military action. This is in contrast to the U.S., which avoids Security Council whenever it can, and usually prefers to act unilaterally. So the Russians actually go, and the UN Security Council gave them and the Syrians their blessing to have the Russians fight these jihadis. Well, Samantha Power, who's the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and is really, really hardline. She obviously has no love in her heart for the Russians or the Syrians. You should listen to her rhetoric sometimes. Anyway, moving along. Samantha Power didn't even bother to show up. She sent her deputy, Michelle Sison, to speak and vote for the U.S. But here's some interesting bits of the resolution. The Security Council calls upon member states that have the capacity to do so to take all necessary measures in compliance with international law, as well as international human rights, refugee and humanitarian law, on the territory under the control of ISIL, also known as Daesh, in Syria and Iraq, to redouble and coordinate their efforts to prevent and suppress terrorist acts committed specifically by ISIL, also known as Daesh, as well as ANF and other individuals, groups, undertakings, and entities associated with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. Continuing from the resolution here, the Security Council has not only backed Russia's military campaign, all necessary means, but it has also made clear that Russia is fully entitled to extend this campaign to all other individuals and groups. So there goes the U.S. and Turkish cover for having our friendly terrorist proxy armies roaming around committing havoc. The UN has said no, not that that'll stop us. It never does. But the UN has said no. The resolution names, amongst these terror groups, the Al-Nusra Front. Oh, are these the guys we're currently dropping tow missiles to? Isn't that Al-Nusra? I get a little confused sometimes. But certainly Al-Nusra is closely coordinated with ISIS and with Al-Qaeda. Not that it matters, what color flag they're flying or what they're calling their group this week. These are very porous groups. And they work closely together. So among these terrorist groups is the Al-Nusra Front. Russia is therefore fully authorized to bomb all the various jihadi groups in Syria that it is bombing. So there are no moderate jihadis. That's just a nonsense. Even Telesur, which is one of the better news agencies out of the Southern Hemisphere, said recently, quote, "The Islamic State is the latest weapon utilized by Washington that, much like Al-Qaeda, is certainly backfiring." And they gave some interesting statistics in this article, which I need to talk about a little bit, because we need to talk about the people and the deaths and those injured and those killed and those displaced. Well, let's just deal with the dead. Those are easy numbers. No, actually, they're very hard numbers, but let's just deal with this. So, Telesur notes that according to Statista, which is a website that specializes in statistics on a number of issues around the world, came up with a number of a worldwide death toll from extremist attacks, between 2006 and 2013 at some 200,000 people. That's 1/5 of a million. This is from extremist attacks, terrorists, Boko Haram, ISIS, on and on and on. But in contrast to this, in March of this year, the Physicians for Social Responsibility group, that's an American group, who actually received a Nobel Peace Prize, although Obama got one of those too, so I'm not sure what they're worth anymore. That certainly decreased their resale value. But they released a report in March of this year saying that U.S. interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan alone killed close to 2 million. And that figure was closer to 4 million when tallying up the deaths of civilians caused by the U.S. in other countries such as Syria and Yemen. And they go on to say the Islamic State is the latest weapon being used in this war. Because, of course, we use these proxy armies. We always have. We always will. But look at those numbers. 4 million, closer to 4 million people killed. We roll in all the civilians. From the U.S. interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan alone, versus 200,000 dead in all countries from terrorist attacks. 200,000, 4 million, and we're supposed to be the good guys. We are supposed to be the good guys. We're not supposed to be the ones who are blowing up the innocents. We're not supposed to be the ones who are destroying not just countries, but whole civilizations. Whole civilizations, such as Iraq, such as Syria. And the ruins at Palmyra that were on TV, and that ISIS was blowing up sort of for fun, that is, the parts they weren't shipping overseas for Westerners to buy. I don't know if you heard that story, but there were numerous reports, and a wealthy American couple involved in the Hobby Lobby Corporation, if I remember correctly, were apparently the recipients of some of these illegally obtained and illegally smuggled antiques from the cradle of civilization. One of the first things that happened when Baghdad fell is the museums were looted, especially the antiquities museums were looted. And the U.S. let it happen. The U.S. let it happen. So my point, though, is that these are ancient civilizations. These are the cradle of Western civilization. And yet, they're not these, they were doing pretty well until we got involved. And we got involved because being an empire that was picking up for the French Empire and picking up for the British Empire and picking up for everyone else and getting creating the emerging American empire, the U.S. either had to knock off their governments or invade them wholesale. So we would, whenever there was a democratic election, think Mossadegh in the 1950s in Iran. Mossadegh, democratically elected, very open and free election. And he wouldn't cough up enough protection money to the oil companies, to put it one way. So the U.S. removed him and installed the Shah of Iran, a ruthless dictator, or Pinochet in Chile. The list goes on and on and on, and I've talked about it on this show before, and I'll continue to. But the point is, these were civilized places with civilized people who had long histories longer than Americans can imagine. But it is this tragic imperial suicide that drives us on. We keep pretending, too, we're all going to get rich from this, or at least America's going to get rich of this. But even Paul Krugman has changed his mind on this. He wrote recently, quote, "If you're a modern wealthy nation, war, even easy, victorious war, doesn't pay." And this has been true for a long time. In his famous 1910 book, The Great Illusion, the British journalist Norman Angell argued that military power is socially and economically futile. As he pointed out, in an interdependent world, which already existed in the age of steamships, railroad, and the telegraph, war would necessarily inflict severe economic harm even on the victor. Furthermore, it's very hard to extract golden eggs from sophisticated economies without killing the goose in the process. Well, I think we're killing that goose. Or rather, I don't know, we're chopping up the goose wholesale and feeding it to our oligarchs. And I don't say our oligarchs lightly. I'm in good company here. Lawrence Wilkerson, who was a career officer, Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, has said that defense contractors control America's war-making decisions. We are, de facto, an oligarchy. And lots of people have picked this up, and I think I'll go to the bottom of the show, reading a little bit from Tom Englehart's work. This is from 12 November of this year. He says, let's begin with the $12 billion in shrink-wrapped $100 bills. $12 billion in shrink-wrapped $100 bills. Iraqi oil money held in the U.S. The Bush administration began flying it to Baghdad on C-130s soon after U.S. troops entered that city in April 2003. Essentially dumped into the void that had once been the Iraq state, at least 1.2 to 1.6 billion of it was stolen and ended up years later in a mysterious bunker in Lebanon. And that's just what happened as the starting gun went off. It's never ended. In 2011, the final report of the congressionally mandated Commission on Wartime Contracting estimated that somewhere between $31 billion and $60 billion taxpayer dollars have been lost to fraud and waste in the American quote-unquote reconstruction of Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, for instance, there was a $75 million police academy hailed as crucial to the U.S. efforts to prepare Iraqis to take control of their own security. But it was so poorly constructed it proved a health hazard, with urine and feces raining from the ceilings. The private contractor, of course, who was supposed to fix it, agreed to, but I understand asked for more money and never actually repaired it, and it is still unrepaired. Or there is the $23 million gas station. $23 million gas station in Pakistan. They were building this in Afghanistan. In Pakistan, the same gas compression and where you would compress and then sell natural gas to vehicles using it. In Pakistan, you could build one for $300,000. In Afghanistan, it was somehow going to be 20 some odd million, 30 million. Really? No, because it's just easy to steal because nobody's counting. This is a scam. War is a scam, and it is a racket, and has always been a racket. Smedley Butler's book, War is a Racket. Brigadier General, United States Marine Corps, said, war is a racket. I could teach Al Capone tricks. Said he resigned because he was tired of being a bagman for the corporations. Anyway, back to Tom Engelhardt. Clearly, Washington had gone to war like a drunk on a bender, while domestic infrastructure began to fray. At $109 billion by 2014, the American Reconstruction Plan in Afghanistan was already, in today's dollars, larger than the Marshall Plan, which helped put all of devastated Europe back on its feet after World War II. Bigger than the Marshall Plan by 2014. That was a year ago. And still, the country is in shambles. In Iraq, a mere $60 billion was squandered on the failed rebuilding of the country. Keep in mind that none of this takes into account the staggering billions spent by the Pentagon in both countries to build strings of bases, ranging in size from American towns with all the amenities of home to tiny outposts. There would be 505 of them in Iraq, and at least 550 in Afghanistan. Most were in the end abandoned, dismantled, or sometimes simply looted. And don't forget the vast quantities of fuel imported into Afghanistan to run the U.S. military machine in those years, some of which was siphoned off by American soldiers to the tune of at least $15 million and sold to Afghans on the sly. Tom Engelhardt concludes, quote, in other words, in the post-9/11 years, Reconstruction and war have really been euphemisms for what in other countries we would recognize as massive systems of corruption. And I continue to be amazed that so many people want to become high-ranking persons in these corrupt institutions. They want to get power. They want to get money. And in so doing, the very mechanisms and the very ends that they pursue destroy the country, collapse the infrastructure, expand the expense of everything, strip the civil liberties from ordinary people. And always, there's this hue and cry, we won't protect your freedoms, but you have to give up all your freedoms so we can put them in a box under lock and key and look at them all the time. That's the idea of freedom. And I watched the presidential, I glance from time to time at comments from some of the current presidential people, and they all want to play. Some of them more obviously than others. Hillary and Donald and Bush. I mean, Hillary and Bush are deeply ensconced in the systems. I recall one of the Wall Street bankers saying, really, Hillary or Bush would be fine for us either way. We give money to both campaigns, and they do, because it really doesn't matter to them. Yet, the toil, the blood, the sadness, the destruction, all to enrich the military contractors, the oligarchs, the oil companies, who actually do run the policy of the United States to a huge extent, and of the military, and of our wars, of the wars where we send our young people to kill other young people for no good reason whatsoever. We keep doing it, and we keep letting them do it. So my question for you this Thanksgiving is, why? Why do we keep doing it? What can we do differently so this wouldn't be the case? Oh, but don't worry. There'll be another great tragedy somewhere. There'll be a terrorist event, and there will. There'll be an explosion. There'll be a plane crash. There'll be, I don't know, some kind of horrible attack. And it will be horrible. And people will be afraid, and the government will tell you, you be very careful. You should not travel out of the U.S. because you're at great danger. We don't have any specific threats, but you're at great danger. So ISIS has threatened to attack the planet Earth. Okay, thanks for that, State Department. And people will panic, and people will listen to the ridiculous rhetoric that we've heard time and time and time and time again. You're under attack. Those are the bad guys. We're gonna go do it, but we gotta have all this authorization. Don't ask how much it costs. Why do you hate America? You're either for us or you're for the terrorists. Nonsense. We should be smarter than that. We should be smarter than that. And I hope we all become so before we get any closer to midnight on that clock. That concludes today's show, Long Waves, with me, Gary Krug. You've been listening to KYRS, Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 FM. I've got to tell you briefly here that if you've got a car or boat or truck lying around and you just want the thing gone and you want to do some good at the same time, call toll free 855-KYRS-CAR. 855-597-7227. We'll arrange free pickup. You'll get a tax deduction, and we will get a little bit of cash to help keep the station on the air. I hope you've enjoyed today's show. You can write me longwaves at kyrs.org. Find me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio, and podcasts of most of the shows are available on YouTube. Just put Long Waves Radio in quotes. You'll turn me right over. Thanks again for listening. I'd love to hear from all of you. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and seriously, let's try to be smarter. Let's not get fooled again.